Something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, sponsored by Fieldstone Communities, Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers innovative and compassionate care, now accepting residents. They also offer day stay and respite programs. So grab a pencil and write down this number, 360-689-4314, to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Willing Bay today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the Senior Community Center is on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. We honor them and are grateful for their hospitality. And we are also grateful for Ann Lovejoy, who is here with us today on the eve of the autumnal equinox.
Right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Here we go. Here's autumn. It's here.
Well, and isn't it amazing how just like, boom, the weather shifts just like that. It's amazing. We're not going to see any more 80 degrees, or at least it's very unlikely. We're going to be looking at a lot more 70s, and already the nights have been dipping into the 40s. And I've had people say, how come my basil turned black? Or how come my tomatoes look so unhappy? Or whatever. And that is why those cold nights, tropicals do not care for them. And you may see some damage on things like beans, peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, a little remay, a little cover of floating row cover over them, kind of help them get them through. Especially it's sort of frustrating because some of them were so slow to get started. Oh my gosh, the beans seem to take forever this year, and now they're finally going. It's like too ironic that it's starting to get too cold for them. So a little bit of protection at night can make sure those beans keep on ripening, and tomatoes too, same thing. But the one thing you really want to remember is even though it hasn't been raining and it's super dry, you still want to take that cover off in the morning, because there's been really heavy dews. When the dew point and the temperature are close, you get real heavy dew, which is why a lot of plants are still alive with, long, dry stretch. They've been suffering, but the dew is keeping them alive. But if it's trapped under the cover that you put on to protect them from the frost, it can create sort of mold and mildew situations as the day heats up. So you want to put the cover on at dusk, take it off when you have your morning coffee or whatever, and then that should help your plants keep going for at least for another few weeks, and maybe even longer, depending on whether we get a mild stretch or sudden cold. So that's one thing. I had a question from someone who said, my black tomatoes are hard as rocks. What am I doing wrong? And I get this all the time. The black tomatoes, there's a bunch of different ones. They're like indigo promise, indigo children. There's many, many of them. And they're all hand-bred, not GMO, hand-bred from species that grow on the Galapagos Islands that have a lot of natural cyanidins in them, which is the coloring agent, but it's also what makes blueberries have such good health benefits. So this extra coloring is like sunscreen for the plant. It keeps the leaves from getting burned in the tropical environments. It also creates high anthocyanin levels in the fruit itself, which is really good for you, right? But here's the thing, those shiny black fruits, tomatoes, are not ripe. When they're ripe, they turn matte and dull, and they get a little bit soft. And usually if you look at the base, not the blossom, and the bottom, not where it's attached to the stem, but if you look at the blossom end, you can see usually there's a little red, you'll see a little red flush or sometimes a red star, depending on the type. And that means when you can feel that they're give with a little bit of pressure, they're not shiny anymore, that's when they're ripe and they taste amazing. But before that, they taste terrible. The one thing you can do if you get stuck with a huge amount of unripe black tomatoes and the frost comes and the plant gets killed, they are fabulous roasted. So even though they're usually fairly small, you can slice them, put them in the oven with a little bit of olive oil, a little salt, 225 for like 2 hours, and they won't burn, but they'll get like fruit leather almost, and they're delicious that way. But otherwise, yeah, not so much. Right? Several people were worried about the smoke damage on their plants, and that is actually very legitimate because smoke and ash and even dust can actually clog the pores, the little openings on the plant leaf called stoma that are how plants photosynthesize, how they get their nutrients out of the air. So rinsing off your leaves is really a good thing. But really, it's kind of fascinating. We've always assumed that smoke was really bad for plants as it is for people. But surprisingly, some researchers started in like, way back 1980, after Mount St. Helens blew up, the first researchers were realizing that the following years were extremely good ones, like 25% boost for the wheat crop and the grape crops east of the mountains were in the plume of the ash, right? That ash carries a ton of minerals, and that was actually soil building for quite a long time. It ebbed over time, but for a long time, that mineral deposit was actually really beneficial. And so just like the smoke from these fires can actually have some of that mineral benefit as well, which we knew. And new studies in California with some of the huge fires they've had down there shows that that smoke actually can trigger, interestingly, the smoke gets diffused in the air, right? And so the light, gets diffused passing through the smoke. Sorry, I'm having a morning here. So the light gets diffused as it passes through the smoke, and the smoke only blocks about 4% of the sunlight, which is much less than we had thought before. And the way the smoke diffuses sunlight lets the light penetrate more deeply into the dense tree canopies, especially, which increases their photosynthetic efficiency and boosts overall plant productivity. Well, that is amazing, right? What's more, even in some of the bogs they've been studying in Canada and in northern Washington state, they found that some of the restored wetlands particularly benefited from smoke. They're not exactly sure why. They think it might be some of that mineral efficiency, and also because the way the light is filtered might be more beneficial for some of those wetland plants. But I just thought that was kind of interesting that it's not all terrible news for once, right? Mm-hmm. But I still think it's really important to rinse your leaves. And I do that pretty often anyway. Though I have to tell you, my pea patch, my community garden is right next door to the Madrona School, which just did a huge summer renovation of their playground and brought in literally tons of materials, sand, dirt, gravel, wood chips, and all this stuff was blowing all over the plants. And a lot of people were washing them off carefully, but I was really busy this summer and I didn't. And what I found is that my kale was, for the first time in a really long time, my kale was not attacked by those white cabbage moth butterflies at all. My kale was perfect because it was covered with dust. Like, it was great. It's also true that if you have a lot of those white, they're little white butterflies, right? And they love the whole cabbage family, especially kale, cabbage, broccoli, even things like chard, which are in a different family, they'll still happily eat some of that, but especially that cole family, they love it. And one of the things that I figured out is that with the kales, they are much less fond of the rugged types. So the wrinkly ones that are called like dinosaur kale or lacinato, the laciniated, the real lacy ones, or the really frilly Russian ones, those are very rarely bothered. The butterflies seem to not process them as a good landing spot, which is great. So if you're having trouble, you might want to grow a lot of the very textury kales for a few years. And then, because part of it is, they lay their eggs, some of them winter over, and they're all ready to hatch in the spring. But if a few seasons go by and there's nothing for them to eat, then the eggs don't last forever, and then you'll eventually get rid of them, more or less.
Employees to work here anymore. Think about that.
Somebody needs to mute.
Somebody needs to mute. Yeah, there we go.
And you can't even get.
Does anybody have a question, or I was trying to decide if somebody was kind of just trying to step in here?
Good job.
I can't tell who it is. Can you?
I can't. I'm trying to find somebody. Please, could everybody please mute? If you don't have a question, if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we will
happily take it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So I see it's like Takane and the second Lisa Giles one are the only two I see that are not muted.
Yeah.
Sure what to do about that.
I don't know either. It's not letting me mute. So, okay.
Okay. Right. Anyway, we'll just roll along with it. So Karen, how about you? Do you have anything going on in your garden that you're curious about?
Lots. I want to get rid of my lawn.
Brilliant. The time is coming up. This is a good time to start thinking about that, because when the rains return, please, please, please that they do, that's when a really good time for lawn renovation or lawn, getting rid of the lawn, like swapping out lawn for a little a little bee patch, like pollinator patch, is a really great idea. And fall is a wonderful time to do that because a lot of the slow, cooler winter months are prime time for root growth. And that's what you want to do, is get things in the fall, let them get free water for, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 months, and have nice root establishment before the hot summer comes again. This was a really rough summer, as you all know, really record string we had more days over 90 than I think maybe only one off our all-time high, which was 2015. Really, really blistering hot summer, if you recall. We've had far more 80-degree days than usual in August and into September. And the nights were pretty high temp too, and of course, dry as a bone. And all those things are really, really hard on gardens. And one of the things you'll see is that lawns with shallow rooting and most turf sodded lawns are not resilient at all because they don't have deep roots. And the way that most of them are watered, they don't need to have deep roots. But one of the good news about that is then they're easy to get rid of. There's a great technique. It's like one person has a sharpened shovel. You get a bastard file and put a sharp edge on a flat shovel, and you can sort of literally shove it under the edge of the sod and it will lift right up. Rita and I both have these amazing shovels that are root slayers, they're called, and they've got teeth on them, and they're heavy and they're amazing, and you can get into anything with very little. They're heavy, so you don't have to put a lot of oomph into it. You just go and it slides right underneath. And then if one person starts rolling up the sod like a carpet and the other person goes cut, 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 and you do it in chunks. You don't have to do the whole entire lawn at once, but take out a strip, maybe 2 feet or 3 feet wide, get that. And then you can stack those sods. And if you do green side down and then brown sides together, green sides together, and make a pile like that, but you want the green side down on the bottom that's on the dirt so that it doesn't root back in, right?
Right.
And water those down, put a tarp over it, maybe put some little wood chips or something on top, and that will rot down and make really nice soil for you. And then you can actually have like a raised bed in the place where all that stuff rots down. Right?
Well, I like that idea.
So that's a really good way to get rid of a lawn and turn it into something else. In the meantime, now you've got this open area. And when you're starting to get rid of lawns, if you have a big one, it's really a lot to take on Kansas. Like you open it all up and all of a sudden you have this huge area, which is going to get full of weeds and all kinds of stuff before you have a chance to really establish it. So it's smart to sort of do strips. Like if you have a garden bed or you have an area you want to work at, start with one strip, 2 to 3 feet wide, as far as you can reach, and just open that up, put some compost on top. If the soil is really horrible, you can put some humic acid on top. Granulated humic acid is the active ingredient in compost, and it helps the soil open up. It's not a nutrient as such, but it helps with the texture and the openness and what we call the hand or the quality of the soil. So, and then on top of that, you can put some compost and you can sow seedlets of native wildflowers or native perennials and things like that. The thing about that is if you don't know what they look like, it's really hard to tell when they come up what's a weed and what's the thing you just wanted, that you just sowed, right? So I always say when you're sowing new things, put a few pots there and put some of that like blue painter tape on it and write on there California poppy or everlasting or sweet woodruff or whatever. I mean, whatever the thing is that you're sowing your seeds of, and then you can see those seedlings and get a look at what they look like and take pictures of them. 1 week, 2 week, 3 weeks. Oh, okay, that's that. And then you'll have a little kind of like a reference book of what the seedlings of the beneficial plants you have are going to look like, as opposed to your weedy plants. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because I can't tell you, in the early days, I would sow all this stuff and then see all this stuff come up and forget, 6 months later, I'd be weeding it all out and then go, oh,
that was a flower.
That was probably that stuff that I spent all the time doing and spent money on. So those little tips will help you make good choices when you're ripping stuff out.
Right.
It's also good if you're not super familiar with some of the weeds to take pictures of a plant you're not sure about And there's some good plant ID apps you can download that you can take a picture of it and it will tell you what it probably is.
Oh.
Or you can just keep taking pictures until it blooms and then you're like, oh, I know what that is. And that's not what I want. But before it goes to seed, it's doing no harm. So you can let it go to flower and then start taking it out, but keep the pictures to remind yourself of the different stages. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And we have that technology in our phones.
Yeah,
Just
you
take
can make little
pictures.
files, like a weed file and a good stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's a great idea, Ann. Thank you.
Yeah, ask me how I learned, right?
Hey, we get the benefit from your mistakes.
That's how, almost everything we know that's good stuff comes from doing it wrong the first 3 times or whatever. One thing that I learned very late in life was like, leave the plant tag in place if the plant dies. I cannot tell you how many times I would plant something and it wouldn't work. And I'd take everything out. And then a year later or whatever, I'd come back and go, oh, it seems like that would do great here. No memory. Put that in. And maybe the 3rd time I'm like, haven't I done this before? And I recently did a garden consultation for some lovely people who were like, yeah, this is the 3rd rhododendron we've had here, or the 4th. I can't even remember anymore. And I was like, see, that's a clue. Pay attention.
It doesn't belong there.
It's not going to happen. If you want it here, get a big pot or container and put it on top and then put your plant in that, because that spot is not going to be a good host for that plant if it's died 3 or 4 times. So when you don't take the plant tags away, I used to joke it looked like a mouse's graveyard in parts of my garden. It's just little white markers everywhere. But it made me go, oh yeah, wait, no, I've already done that. It didn't work 1, 2, 3 times. Okay, no, something else is called for, right? So
Right.
allowing ourselves to learn from mistakes means sometimes you have to leave some of the evidence, right?
Right. Well, I'm hoping to integrate my 3 blueberry bushes into the landscape. Take them out of the pots and integrate them. So
Now your blueberries are doing really well, right?
yes.
Yeah. So I'd hesitate to put them in the ground unless you know that your ground is actually really good.
Oh no, I would. Yeah, that's true. Maybe I'll leave them in the pots. I don't know. I haven't decided what to do yet. So
sometimes plants that are doing really well in containers, maybe the next step is a bigger container. A lot of times our soils here, especially in housing developments, the land has been scraped. They're just scraped down to subsoil. There's a very small amount of topsoil, which is usually often just like fill, not even good stuff at all. And then maybe there's only a few inches. And you can really see the way some of the new plants, when you dig, they've died and you dig them up and they look like there's a gallon plant and it has a big wide, like a top hat, circle of shallow roots that it was trying hard to put out, but everything underneath it is dead. It drowned it in the clay, right? Yeah. And it's trying desperately. And it's like, that's not a hospitable environment. So the trick is, if you don't feel like you have a good place to put them in a really rich, beautiful soil, you're probably better off getting bigger containers for that. And then looking for some really tough, easygoing, pretty evergreen ground covers that will do the same thing, like in terms of just a nice stretch of greenery, doesn't need much maintenance. And the thing I really like to use a lot of is Epimedium, or bishop's hat, it's called. And there's a lot of different kinds, EPI, it's like Epimedium, right? And there's a lot of different kinds, different sizes. Most of them are evergreen, a couple are not. So you want to be sure you get the ones that are, if that's what you're looking for. And the cool part is they're pretty tolerant of sun and shade, of drought, and many things once they're established. Rita's nodding because she and I've been keeping some alive at the senior center that we transplanted right before it got the hottest, driest summer in record, right? But they're very tough and enduring. And once they're established, they're amazingly strong. They usually have nice fall color, which they carry through the winter. They'll turn amber, bronze, copper, kind of reddish. And then when they start to look ratty in January, or late January, early February, you want to weed whack them or cut them to the ground, and then they bloom. And they have these beautiful, wiry little curved stems with little dangling, they look like birds on a wire, like dangling orchid-like flowers. They're beautiful. They're small, they're dainty, but then that's all you do for the rest of the year. They don't fertilizer, you water them for a couple of years to make sure they get established. Once established, they're good. And so Epimedium grandiflora, big flower, is the kind I usually use because they're just absolutely bomb-proof. And
So
we
it's
need
bishop's hat.
bishop's hat, epimedium. Epimedium grandiflora means big flower.
Okay, I got it.
So that's a good one. In a really hot, dry, sunny place, there are a number of oreganos. And Rita and I've also been tending the oreganos at the senior center, noticing that some of them looked great for a pretty long time. And then they really did need a little water over the summer. But generally speaking, they're only in the ground 1 year. I think that by the time they've been in the ground 2 or 3 years, they will be pretty firmly established, and they won't need water after that. But this first year, we put them in April last year, Earth Day, and it's been a pretty hot, dry stretch for them. So we have seen some of them not react as well, but a lot of them will make a solid ground cover, evergreen, and then throw up these long stems and have really beautiful flowers, which are white, pink, purple. There's probably 150 kinds of oregano. Most people think of the one, but there's many. There are many culinary oreganos, and there are many just sheerly ornamental oreganos. And so that piece, I think, is important because those are also pretty indestructible for a hot, dry, sunny situation. But again, you're going to want to spend good 2 summers, possibly 3 summers, watering them, making sure they get what they need.
Yeah.
But once they're established, they're amazing. And it's another plant that you can plant it will start filling in. If you have one patch, you can rip them up in the middle of November when it's wet and the ground is wet, and put 1-inch pieces about 6 inches apart, or just pull a piece off, dip that, put some compost over them, and they'll spread and make a big mat, right? And that mat will stay evergreen. And after the flowers go, if they start to die off or look funky, you can cut them off. Or sometimes I will leave them, because you'll find that a lot of little birds love those seeds.
Oh, yeah.
And I really like little birds in my garden. So I tend to leave things like that and let them make their, their full cycle, right?
Right.
And they'll even sow themselves around. So I get sown patches where the seeds have been dropped, and then you get I like things like that. I am not, guess what? Big surprise news. I'm not a really tidy gardener.
Yes. And neither am I. I want to take care of my feathered friends and my pollinator friends.
Yeah, and I like to see what nature does, right?
Right.
So one of the great things with oreganos is at the foot of a rock wall, you always get a ton of weeds, right? Always. But if you plant some oreganos on the top and tuck a few in the bottom, or they'll sow themselves down to the bottom, and pretty soon you'll have a nice edging of this evergreen, tough, sturdy plant, right? In a hot, sunny place, you can't really beat it. And again, there's so many kinds. Rita.
What are those little purple ones that we have at the senior center?
Yeah, there's some really minute, they're teeny ones. They're called mountain oregano, and they're really dense, small, and they're like 6 inches, 8 inches maybe.
And they have the most beautiful little purple flowers. I'm going to those and put them someplace. So
they're really fragrant, and they're amazing. And so this, one of the things we're going to do at the senior center is pull some of the big tall ones that got kind of sprawly, and pull the little ones apart and plug them along the front, so that front edge will stay a little neater. And we'll put some of the big ones in the back, at the back garden, where they can be tall and sprawly, because they're all total magnets for pollinators.
Yeah.
And they're
There's a million bees. There's a million bees on them. In that garden when I was there the other day. There's so many. So cool to watch them.
And you see so many different ones. It's really fascinating. All these other, not just bees, but other pollinators too. Soldier beetles I'm starting to see, which are really good. They eat aphids.
Oh,
black.
They're our friends.
Yeah, they're good. Your pals, right?
Yeah.
But those are some really good, very simple, easy to grow. And like I said, any of those plants that you can pull apart and make more of yourself, that's a really good bargain. And same with epimediums. The only problem with the epimediums is they have an incredible root system, and it takes the killer shovels like Rita and I have, that root slayer, and you have to jump on it to get through. But boy, it will do it. And chunk them up into small pieces, and you can dot those around, and they will run happily, spread and fill in. And they pretty much choke out everything, which is awesome.
Yeah. So how do you feel about mints or spearmints?
So mint, it's funny, I love mint, but mint can be a problem. And I have most of my gardens up in troughs, but the mint's the ground, and it doesn't care what kind of ground you have. Mint will grow in anything. And it runs around under the troughs, between the troughs, and around the troughs. And my neighbor who just moved from Venezuela here, she's always looking for mint, and I'm like chunking it out and giving her piles of it. And because she uses a lot of mint in her cooking, right? I just love it for the smell, and the pollinators love it. But I gotta say, I would not put mint in a garden again. When we first started the gardens up at the library, I think you probably all seen those big library gardens. We started those about 25 years ago, and we didn't have any budget to speak of, and we didn't have many plants. And the renovation of the library had involved, oh, well, too long a story. But anyway, some of the trees got killed. A lot of stuff didn't live. They did that thing of putting all the blue clay out of the parking lot into the beds. Thank you so much. And then plugging in plants that all drowned. So I started the Friday Tidy to kind of renovate and try to find things that would succeed there. When we had the first worm, when we found the first worm 2 or 3 years down the road, we had a worm party. We were so excited. What broke that soil up for us was mint. And a friend of mine in Oregon has this big wholesale nursery. And when I told her about this project, she sent up at the end of the season, she sent us like 80 or 90 flats of mostly of mint and some perennials and stuff. But there was about 30 kinds of mint. And it was amazing because that will go down and open the soil for you. It will do the digging. It's like little tillers, right? So without soil disturbance as such, the way like tilling or forking or turning the soil really is very destructive of the soil biota, the living creatures in that soil. But if you want the mint to be your shovel, so much easier, right? And once you have an area that's open and you decide that, thank you so much, you don't actually need an acre of mint, you can start removing it. And the really cool way to do that is by using very deep mulches, 8 to 12 inches of wood chips, which is a good smother mulch. It will even smother out ivy.
Wow.
We did programs, Kitsap, when we were working on weed suppression with the Weed Warrior, the Kitsap version of that, they found that 8 to 12 inches of wood chips, coarse wood chips, the kind that's sold as hog fuel, very cheap, that will smother out most of the ivy in about 3 to 6 months. And what's left can be pulled out pretty easily all the way with the roots, because that much wood chips as a deep mulch will actually open the soil too. And then you can get the roots out much more easily. So it's not the thing to do by your front walk because it's going to look a little weird, but anywhere that you have a persistent weed problem and really have a hard time getting stuff out, you can do a couple things. You can fight your weeds with mint, which will win.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can do the deep mulch and start pulling the mint out and reclaiming some of that soil that's now been cleaned up, right?
Okay.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't plant it under my roses, for instance.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
I was just chuckling to myself when I saw an article recently that said that strawberries make a wonderful ground cover. And I was like, yeah, in what world?
yeah.
They will spread for sure, happily, but they don't smother out weeds, and they don't really overlap strongly enough to make a real dense cover. So they're fine for, a season or two, but they're not really a kind of ground cover that you can sort of do it once and walk away. Actually, there are not too many things you can do that for, because you really, even these tough things, even mint, you have to water it for a while.
Yeah.
You can't just dig it up in August and shove it in and think it's going to happen, because it's not.
Let it get established. Yeah.
Yeah. And they need to be able to penetrate the soil. And so some of these really tough soils, it will take even mint a couple of years to get down there and mix it up for you.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to hog all of Anne's time with me redoing my yard. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Let's see. Wow. It's awesome. So, what, a lot of our trees, our leaves are falling off the trees. What should we do with those leaves instead of
good question. That is a great question. And I did want to talk a little about some of the things that are happening with the big leaf maples and some of the other trees.
Yes.
I've written about this a couple times in articles, but I think people don't really pay that much attention until they sort of see it. It's like, oh my gosh, you're driving down the road and you see all these big leaf maples that are white with powdery mildew. And, you know, that's a combination of stresses that creates a perfect situation for powdery mildew. It's usually just disfiguring, but if it's bad enough and it goes on long enough, it can actually really set the plant back, because again, it covers up those little windows, those little stoma in the leaves. And so plants aren't able to photosynthesize effectively when they're covered with powdery mildew like that. But it comes from the prolonged drought. We have been in a state of deep drought, like emergency drought, for a number of years. And now we're not, thank you, January, but we're still in drought. We're just not in an extreme drought. We're just in not so bad drought, right?
Mhm.
But the native plants that have lived here for thousands of years and are pretty habituated to our wet winter, dry summer cycle have really struggled, because we had a number of dry winters as well. And we had extremely hot summers, and those are unusual. Like in the typical Northwestern patterns, a lot of the summers would be gray, overcast, 50s, 60s, but dry. But that's not as stressful for a plant as sunny and 80 or sunny and 90, right? The transpiration is much different for plants in those situations. So they're really stressed out. And then year after year after year after year, the stress accumulates, and they don't have the deep resources to fight that when they're not getting replenished by enough winter water. And even like January was an incredibly wet month, but it's like having a fire hose turned on you is not as refreshing as having a month of soft continual drizzle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the plants are stressed and they're really struggling. And what I would say about saving leaves, like when leaves are dropping from a plant, you want to know why. It's a little early for real leaf fall, but if they're dropping from a plant that's very stressed, is that plant experiencing disease? Is there an underlying problem with it? Are there pests? Are there eggs on the foliage? You know, you want to, because most of us, if we even have a compost, it's not hot enough to kill eggs and disease spores and things, right? Fungi can live over winter in your compost, especially if there's a lot of the fallen leaves that are harboring that disease. They'll be happy as clams all winter long and wake up in the spring ready to go and affect next year's crop. So if there's a disease problem, if there's mold, mildew, fungus, and we've seen a lot of those, black sooty mold has been really big this year, on camellias, on pear trees, on a lot of things. If you feel like there's a disease process going on, rake as many leaves as you possibly can away and put them in the green waste, because the commercial composting facilities do get high temp, and they can take all that stuff out and it won't be in the result. This is a great time to buy compost. In the spring, all the compost facilities were swamped. They couldn't, the products weren't quite up to par because they were trying to turn them out so fast because the need was huge. Right now, most people aren't thinking as much about compost, and you can get really beautiful stuff from Tills or from Indigo. Both of them are putting out beautiful product right now. We just got a huge pile at the library if you want to go take a look at what Tills is making, because we didn't spread it all. 10 yards takes us a while, but it's beautiful. And this is a wonderful time. So if you're raking away the leaves and you're raking away detritus and all that stuff, now you have bare soil. You can put, if it's fruit trees and you want to sweeten it up, you can put a little lime down, you can put granulated humic acid down, and then you can put compost on top of that. And remember that you want to go right to the trunk with the covering, because you just don't want the leaves harboring over the winter, right? So, but the trunk area is not where the compost is doing its real job. That's where you're having a more cosmetic effect from it. Where you're really getting the good out of it is about a 3 to 4 foot strip around the drip line of the tree. That's where the active feeding roots are for trees and shrubs. And so it isn't, you know, people are always throwing it right on the crown. You're like, okay, thank you. But no, because this is, it's like out here, right? In your wingtips, that's where the action is. And that's where you want to put the fertilizers. If you're using any kind of fertilizer at this time of year, it should be like a Dr. Earth product, a low, slow, organic, smelly, you know, the stuff that looks like alfalfa. And actually alfalfa is a really good slow release nutrient for a lot of plants. But I do like the Dr. Earth organics because they are, they're not too high a number. You don't want to force a lot of growth at this time of year for several reasons, but notably because in when you get a lot of new growth in the fall, if we have a hard winter and go down, like last year we hit 17, got a lot of damage from that. New growth is very susceptible, and sometimes that damage will go right down through the branches and canes and kill the plants off. Like a lot of people thought their fuchsias were all gone last year, remember? I don't know if any of you, yeah, they came back. But it's always something to think about, that you don't want to stimulate new growth. You don't want to stimulate new blossoms. Roses, for instance, this is a good time to not just totally clean up under them, because they're susceptible to so many diseases that are foliage diseases. And if you leave those leaves around, they can definitely keep the cycle going with the black spot and mildews and stuff. But clean them up and get that stuff out of there. And then you want to let a few of the hips ripen on the plant. So don't cut off every flower the way, like earlier in the season, we cut back the flowers to the next group cluster of a leaf with 5 leaflets on it, right? That will help the plant know to produce more flowers. But at this time of year, you want some fruit to ripen, because that is a signal that will hormonally trigger the plant to start hardening off at the canes for winter time. And without that signal, it doesn't do it. And granted, we have winters when it doesn't have to, because some of our winters are so mild. You know, what we used to say, January, right? And January could be in January as well as in June. Like sometimes we'd have those cold Junes, but sometimes we'd have those pretty warm Januaries, right? And I've had roses bloom all year round, especially that Chinese one that's called the monthly rose, Rosa chinensis. And it really will put out flowers, at least some, all year round in a mild year, but not when it's 17 degrees. So even on a bush like that, one of the big old shrubs, I'd let them put some hips out. The good thing about that too is that the birds really like a lot of those hips. And so that's another really good source for local wildlife.
Give them some vitamin C.
Yeah. You know, the best ones are those rugosa rose hips, which are huge. And those have the most vitamin C, and they're actually pretty tasty, but they're full of little seeds. I mean, they're not like you pick it up and eat it like an apple, but they do make good tea. You can dry them and put them in tea. And, I think they're really delicious. And so do a lot of other critters, right? So leaving those is a great way to kind of nurture some of the wildlife we have, even in our urban situations.
So there's a lot of apples and pears right now that are ripening up.
Yeah. And here's an interesting thing. One of my neighbors got perfect pears and has had problems in the past. Well, Lisa, you guys did this too. I know 3 people now who are using this kaolin spray to coat the fruit with a very thin layer of clay in the early, and it keeps the apple borers and pear pests from getting into the fruit. And it doesn't keep it. I thought it would restrict the growth, because it seems like you'd put a clay coat on and it would keep it from getting big, but it doesn't. And the growers in Wenatchee have been using it, some of the organic growers. And it actually is very effective at making, lovely unblemished fruit. Isn't that cool? So if you've had trouble with some of those apple pests and pear pests, that might be a way to go.
Yes, Rita.
So would the Ragusa roses be kind of a good thing, maybe to kind of plant it when you're tearing up your lawn?
They're pretty big, and some of them are runners. Right. So you want to be sure, like for you might put them around your pond in the backside or something.
Right. Okay.
That'd be a good place. They're kind of big. They're shrubby.
Right.
They don't get pruned. I like to cut them every 3 years or so, or they get really leggy. But right. if you cut them every 3rd year, or you cut some of the oldest stems every couple of years, then they stay more like 3 to 4 feet instead of 6 or 7 feet, and
right.
leggy and scrawny. But and some of them are really famous for running. And you want to, that Blanc de Couvert is one of the like territorial roses that wants everything. Find it, do a little research. We can check the nurseries and stuff and get some of those. But yeah, they're really good ones for a sunny area. If you're doing, like I used to always love to do kind of a wildlife patch along the side of my property if it abutted a forest or woodland, and you'd plant beautiful native shrubs like, along the side there, and hazelnuts and things that would feed like attract pollinators and then feed birds and squirrels and whatnot, right? But away from the house. But those roses are a good one to throw in the mix because they have flowers that are very attractive and many pollinators,
Right.
very fragrant. And then they have this great fruit and they're indestructible. They don't have any diseases. Yeah.
Hi, this is Judith. Can you hear me?
Yes, Judith. Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question that's got nothing to do with what you're speaking about. Is it okay if I ask you?
Sure.
I recently bought a dwarf ginkgo, and I've been wanting one for a long time. And when I got it, it was in a very, very small pot. And so I transplanted it into a much larger pot, and it looks very happy. But I've been walking around my garden wondering where on earth I'm going to plant this. And I still haven't made up my mind. And I'm wondering if it's too late in the season to take it out of this larger pot and try and plant it somewhere, or should I wait till the spring?
I would wait. For one thing, if you're not really sure, you could have it in a larger pot for a couple of years while you really think about it.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
especially if it's a much larger pot. Small plants don't usually like to go from, say, a 4-inch pot to a gallon or a 5-gallon. That's too big of a stretch for it. But if you're just hopping up a few inches, like going from a 1 gallon to a 5-gallon is usually fine, but not to a 10. Does that make sense?
It's a decorative pot, so I don't really know.
It's probably not even that
I
much.
can't mathematically work out how much how much more earth I've given it, but I really like it. It looks very happy, but it's not growing.
Well,
But it looks very happy, and I'm not overwatering it. I was told not to overwater it. Just, I'm watching the soil, and I'm not fertilizing it or anything. I'm just being very careful. But I just want to, if I should leave it over the winter and try and look for a spot, meanwhile, in the
sure.
spring, I should do that.
Oh yeah. And they're
So
very
what's a
hardy.
good, how much sun will it need?
They take a lot of sun, but they don't need a ton of sun. They do better with morning sun than afternoon sun. Especially if it's one of the golden ones or the lighter colored ones. Sometimes
They told me it will turn yellow or orange in the fall.
they all do that, and they get really good.
Oh,
fall
do they?
color when they get more sun, they get good fall color. Hopefully, it's a male, because the females produce
Oh,
this.
well, should I ask it? I mean, I don't know how to determine that.
So a lot of the named forms are male because the females have this fruit that smells like baby vomit.
Ooh.
What does?
The fruit. And weirdly enough,
Oh.
the fruit is what they make that memory enhancing thing out of. Thank you so much. But when I grew up in Massachusetts, we had a beautiful, big, mature, beautiful ginkgo, but it was a female. And the whole neighborhood would turn out and be like, I volunteer to rake your yard because I want to get that. It was horrible. But these days, most of the named forms are male. And so you can check you can Google it, or you can check with the nursery if it's male or female. And unless
It doesn't have a smell now.
Oh, no, the leaves don't smell. I mean, actually the leaves have a really pleasant smell when they almost caramelize a little bit when they fall. And they're beautiful. Those golden fans, they're lovely.
Unfortunately, I have a garden that's surrounded by very tall trees, which is very problematic. And I have to, I have very limited sunny spaces. So I'm looking very carefully. I just don't know what's a good place.
Well, I think it depends on which one you have too, because the size of a dwarf ginkgo can vary quite a bit. Like, because the big ones are like 100 feet tall, some of them are tiny. They're going to get like 2 feet, right? Like Marican or something. I forget exactly, but that's one. But there's others, and that is one that's often used in sort of like bonsai. They are really small. There's what's it called? A weeping dwarf one too.
I think this is larger than the very tiny ones.
Yeah. So
they told me it would grow outwards rather than upwards. but you know, so I'm going to keep it then until the spring, and hope it. Now, should I bring it inside in the winter if it gets very cold?
No, they're perfectly hardy. But the thing is, you want to think about, like, if it's, find out what the ultimate, because some of them, like the American, if it's that one, which is, it has some named forms, but that it typically can get maybe 3 to 4 feet wide and only maybe 2.5 feet tall. So a big generous container, it could live in forever, and you could have that be a focal point in a sunny part of your yard. And that might be better than trying to plant it in the root shadow of those big tall evergreens, because that's a really challenging situation for any tree.
I mean, we've got a lot of cedars. Our neighbors have cedars, and when you try and plant anything near them, there's roots that are just, I can't dig them.
Well, it's digging won't help because they'll just grow back. So in a situation like that,
I know that.
You'd be better off investing in a really large container.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
And there's some lovely ones, you know, so that becomes a piece of garden art. And that tree, if it's, but check the label and check with your nursery to make sure that you know.
Yes, I should have bought the tag out, and so that I could be professional and tell you, oh, it's a such and such. But well, thank you very much for your handy hints.
Well, and the thing is, a lot of us are better off with big containers, because even when we don't have giant trees now, there probably were giant trees in the past. And a lot of times, especially in newer areas where a clearing was made and the house has been built and the house isn't that old, those roots are still in the ground, even though they took the trees out. A lot of the times they're still infiltrating. And also, you know, trees are fungally dominated. So they create a fungally dominated soil that's really not what it's not what lawns like, and it's not what a lot of perennials like either. They prefer bacterially dominated soils like meadows, right? Or prairies, plains. And when we bring those kind of plants, like beautiful border plants, into a fungally dominated soil area, it takes a while for everybody to work that out. And they don't always grow as well. I hope does that make sense? And so one of the things I've learned is that in a lot of areas around Bainbridge, a lot of us have really pretty poor soil, and it's hard to improve it, but it takes a long time. And just layering, don't till, don't try to do that. Just layer every single year. And that does make a big difference. But also there's many situations where you have existing tall trees where you're much better off putting plants in really big containers. And that's why, Karen, I think your blueberries would probably do better in big, generous containers. Like get one of those troughs, you know, those water troughs.
I love that idea. Get the big aluminum,
they're feed troughs or water troughs. And what you have to do, they have one plug usually that unscrews, which after trying to get it out for a long time, I finally figured out it unscrews the other way. Never mind. But then you have to drill holes in the metal bottom to make sure it's on drainage, and you put it up on cinder blocks or on bricks so that there's air circulation on the bottom. But if you had 2 blueberries in one of those, and they would probably do very well and be much happier.
And I love the way they look.
Well, they're so much easier to take care of. You don't have to bend over.
Oh, and I'm really for that.
I know. I have vertigo, especially at this time of year. And so one of my older friends who still gardening in her 90s said, honey, here's the secret. When you have to get down, do every single thing that needs to be done down there before you try to get up again. And always carry a 5-gallon bucket, because you can lean on your 5-gallon bucket and get up. And I thought, oh yeah, well, now I get it. She's so right.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Yeah,
I know. So those troughs are wonderful because they really, and you know, at the senior center, we have 3 of them. And this year we thought we were going to be doing a renovation, so we didn't like open them up for other people to use. But what happened was I put the Marshall strawberries in one, the East one, and I put the, Rita, remind me, what are those? Seascape strawberries? Yeah, in the other. And then in the middle, there's a couple of interesting different kinds of kale. And under the big variegated kale, there's a tiny bird nest. And this summer, a bird was under that kale it has those big cream edged leaves, and there was a little bird with eggs in it. It was so cute. The nest is still there. But anyway, the point is, all those strawberries are like dripping with babies, right? And so
Yes.
anybody, if you're interested, we're going to be gathering some of those and potting some of those up, and people can have either the Marshalls, which is the old one that was grown here on the island back in the day, that was the famous, original island strawberry, right? We've got
So delicious.
a couple hundred starts of those.
Oh, they're so good.
They're really good, but they're great in a trough because they're, you don't get slugs up in the trough,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
It's a huge, the reason they were called strawberries is because in the old days, they put straw around the berries to keep the slugs off them. And in the troughs, we just mulched with compost and stuff, but we don't have slugs in the trough. Kind of.
Yeah.
And those troughs make it's warm because of that aluminum. It stays warm, and
Yeah,
it's
Oh,
just
yeah.
the ground is warm when you
right,
put your hand down in it. It's
Oh.
really good, and no bending.
right.
Yeah.
Last year we had tomatoes in them and they did great. We didn't do tomatoes this year because it was so cold and the spring was so late. It was just like, no. But that's if you have one sunny place in your yard and putting in a trough, you could do tomatoes one year and then you'd have to do something else the next year. Or you could do a permanent crop like your blueberries, and just be
Oh,
sure
yeah.
that you're always adding, some organic material
Yes.
every year. And again, maybe like the Dr. Earth fertilizer.
Oh, they love Dr. Earth.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
very slow release, but it's and it's
Mhm.
not too high, so it's not like a shocker. And when plants have been stressed, high levels of nutrients are actually another stressor. I always say it's like trying to give a recovering surgery patient a big steak dinner. That's not what they want. They want the
No.
chicken soup, right? Something
Right.
mild and gentle.
Yes. Yeah. Makes total sense.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, it's gorgeous outside today.
it is. One of the things I've been thinking about too is like I was going to talk a little about the Hearty Fuchsias.
Oh, yes.
We put in, oh gosh, Rita, what, about 50, I think, Hearty Fuchsias in the back at the senior center.
Yes.
And we planted them really deep. Like a lot of times you want to plant perennials and shrubs and trees about where they are in their pot. But fuchsias are one of those plants that if you plant them a little deeper, not only will they be more drought resistant, they'll really take the cold better too. And so if you replaced fuchsias, then you might want to make sure that you put deep mulch around them. And in this case, right on them, not what I was saying about the drip line, that's good too, but that's a plant you can actually dump a bunch right on top of the crown of it. And that will give it some frost protection and actually make them a little more drought resistant too. But they have been amazing. The hummingbirds love them. And that was part of why, in the back of the senior center, it's like if you have at home a steep hill or an area that's kind of hard to get, we have to like climb over the steps over the handrails and get up there with the hoses and do all this stuff. So it's not a place where we spend a huge amount of time. So we wanted plants that would be pretty and be, easy to care for, but that didn't need a lot of work. And so we put the Epimedium up there, and we're putting a lot of fuchsias up there, and we're going to move some of the oreganos up there to the top rung so that that bed won't need much care, but will still look really pretty good and just only need tending and watering a couple times this summer. And those are good tips for places at home that are hard to reach. If you have slopes that are tough to take care of, both oreganos and the epimediums are really good plants for holding on to a slope or a hillside that's hard. You don't want to mow places like that it's pretty treacherous,
Right.
mowing steep hills.
Yeah.
Well, and as we get older, our balance isn't as good.
Yep.
If we don't have to bend over a lot, it's much better because makes you want to get out in the garden rather than say, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
So I think we need to think about that. It's just one of those things that happen. So let's make our life as beautiful and as simple as we can.
And that is such a good point. And one of the things I was meaning to talk a little bit about is something that actually, Lisa, you're doing, which is in a lot of gardens, as we get older, there are certain areas that are just hard to take care of. And one of the things that is often comes up when people ask me about is like, oh, I have this old rock wall or little stones put together, and there's all these weeds in between them, and they're really hard to get out. And it's true. A lot of times you start pulling the weeds and the whole wall starts to fall apart, right? So Lisa and David are having theirs replaced with those locking stones.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and that's what I did too, because if there's no space between them, you're not going to get weeds or anything else. And then at the base, you can do, like I was saying, some oregano or something at the base, thyme, those kinds of wonderful herbs that are very pollinator friendly, and they'll keep the weeds at bay. And it just eliminates one more task that's really thankless. Like, it isn't fun to weed the same place over and over and over. So what's really smart is sort of treat ourselves and say, we're elders now. We don't have to do this crap over and over and over and over and over, right? We can do something else. And so finding that one trouble spot and saying, I'm going to renovate this. I'm going to get a crew of strapping, attractive young people to come in. And my job will be to point with the wrist and just admire, right? Say, wow, that looks very nice, guys.
I like the way you think, Anne.
And, you know, we owe it to ourselves to eliminate unnecessary stressors.
Right, right.
And that's one of them. And that's the key to sustainability in the garden too, is like making sure that those really daunting, difficult tasks, that we solve them intelligently and not just keep doing it over and over, but think of a permanent solution that's beneficial, right?
Yes, for everybody.
Yeah. And there's so many places like that. Another one's the driveway. I hear this all the time. Like the weeding a driveway, can you think of a less fun task than that? There isn't much. So, you know, with that, what you want to do is get one of the root slayer shovels like Rita and I have, because you can get into the gravel, which is amazing, because most of the time that's really hard to do with a, you know, a hand tool or even a regular shovel. And then once you've got it all cleared out, get more gravel, right?
Yeah.
That's the other piece. And get crushed gravel, because pea gravel is a disaster. It doesn't lock properly, but crushed gravel, you can get crushed clean gravel, like 1/4 inch or 1/4 minus even, and it will allow water to pass through beautifully. It drains really well, but it doesn't pool, and it doesn't make a good attractive surface for weeds. Like if you look at Battle Point, the big paths, those are 1/4 minus.
Yeah.
And they're permeable, but they're not weed friendly.
Right. You can also get a torch, right?
Yeah. Well, somebody told me that those flame torch weeders are being outlawed. So many people have set their houses on fire. I mean, it does seem to me that it's common sense that you wouldn't use a flame weeder on a path that was covered in wood chips, but apparently that's not logical for everybody. And when we had the tent caterpillars so bad, I can't remember how many people set their homes on fire by trying to burn the caterpillars on the walls. I'm just saying, common sense is not as common as all that. So the flame weeders are not always your lead solution, but I think looking at the surface and saying, you know, this needs a renovation, you need a better idea here, that's a good investment.
Right. I know Bob used it and he loved it.
Yeah.
And then we got the 1/4 inch, you know, flat stone, and then that solved the problem. It really did.
It really does. That was the one task my teenagers enjoyed quite a bit. Like flame weeding was, you know, pretty fun. And I always thought every girl should have her own flamethrower, but
absolutely,
it's one of those power tools that, you know, you can really have a good time with.
I've got one.
But these days, I think stone and gravel is probably a more safe and sane solution, especially it's so dry. I would not really encourage
that's true.
Out there flaming around.
Well, Anne, thank you so much. We just love you. And so we'll see you in October, and everybody else here. Thanks for all.
Thank you.